Welcome to the lesson on ideal body proportions. In this lesson, we're going to look at a basic framework for drawing out the measurements correctly of the human body. But before we do that, we need to actually understand what are proportions, right? What are proportions? Proportions are the size, the spacing, and the location of elements, right? In any particular design. So cars can have proportions, people have proportions, and so on and so forth. So they're the size, the spacing, and the location of elements. We build sort of a rule set out of these things to give us some kind of guideline as to what the correct or reasonably correct proportions of the human body should be. So something to remember is that these are really just general guidelines. And the reason we want to emphasize this is because, there's all kinds of body types out there, all kinds of people out there, all ages of people, and so their proportions vary. So the ideal body proportions are really the size, spacing, and location rules of just the idealistic kind of middle-aged person, maybe a 30-year-old, a 40-year-old type of person, someone who's just kind of your general adult person, okay? Other thing to remember with proportions is that when we manipulate proportions, we can get different looks, we can get different styles. So a large part of other drawing styles, for example, drawing manga, drawing Disney style work, drawing cartoons, drawing chibi style things, or American comic book characters, this really has a lot to do with altering the proportions of the general guidelines and using them in different ways to achieve different looks. All right. And then, last but not least, let me say as well, before we move on to the actual body proportions themselves, that this is really something you want to learn off by heart, right? Learn off by heart. And the reason you want to learn this off by heart is if you have some idea of general body proportions that work, that look reasonably correct, then you're able to manipulate the proportions as to how you might want them for a different body type, for a different look, for a different style, right? So you really want to learn proportions off by heart. And truth be told, they're not really very hard to learn off by heart. I would recommend doing just your own drawings of the ideal body proportions, head and the hands. Draw them, stick them on your wall, and every morning just memorize off by heart the main locations of things. Okay, so we're going to look next at a diagram of ideal body proportions here. And it's drawn very basically. It's not drawn to look good. It's drawn so that we can capture some fundamental measurements of the form that we know work and that we know look generally correct, and that we can then use to draw really appealing, believable characters off of these measurements. So let's go ahead and actually start breaking down ideal body proportions here and taking a look at the measurements of the form here. So the first thing to note is that we use a head measuring system to measure everything. So whatever you've defined the head size as can be used to measure out all the rest of the sizes of a particular character. And so here we have the 8 heads system because we're using 8 head sizes, and we've drawn a very typical front view of an average kind of person, middle-aged, at this particular head height, 8 heads. In the first head, we have the head, right? So from the top of the head to the bottom of the chin is the first head. And the second head, the bottom of the second head, aligns with the nipples, right? So this is kind of the nipple line. So we know that the nipples should always be at the bottom of the second head. The bottom of the third head, we have the navel line, right? Or the belly button line, if you wish to call it that. The bottom of the third head is the navel line. And then the bottom of the fourth head is the crotch line. And the crotch lies reasonably around that position. All right. So it's not a very super ultra scientific, super accurate system. It's a general system, right? The bottom of the sixth head is the bottom of the knees, right? So it's the knee line. And then the bottom of the eighth head is the bottom of the feet, right? So the foot line. So we want to remember these very basic kind of front view measurements primarily first. But then we also have a question of width. How wide do we draw things? How wide do we draw the head and the shoulders. And generally speaking, you want to have the shoulder head length to be 2.5 or sometimes even 3 heads wide, right? Depending on how wide the shoulders are that you want, but 3 heads can look right. 2.5 also looks pretty right. And you may also be wondering, well, what about gender differences? Are there some key gender differences? And there certainly are. We'll talk about them shortly. Let's just cover some other things quickly. Next thing is, how long do we put the arms? I mean, how long do normal arms look? So the rule we use here is really that the elbow aligns with the bottom of the rib cage, wherever you may have drawn that or understand that to be in your drawing, or otherwise slightly above the third line, right? The navel line. So slightly above the navel line, we'll draw the elbow line. And that helps us define the length of the upper arm. And then the length of the lower arm is from the elbow down to having the hand meet around halfway on the hips, right? Halfway on the hips is where the hand usually touches. And in a nutshell, that is very typically the idealistic body proportions rule set. You learn these off by heart. You make sure you know the locations of everything, the general width of the shoulders, how to measure out the arm length. The leg length is kind of implied in here because of the bottom of the crotch kind of going down to the 6th head, you know where the knees are, and then 6 to 8 is the rest of the legs. You generally get a good feeling of the length of all of the elements based on the head measurement. So my advice to you once again really is learn these off by heart. It's not really a hard system. You can just really print this out if you wish, put it on your wall and learn it off by heart. However, we do have a question of gender and age differences, right? Gender and age differences, particularly gender differences and age differences we'll cover later on in the course. But in terms of gender differences, instead of drawing out this entire 8 heads model again, having you learn another entire model of head proportions, I thought what would be much better is to really just cover the key differences between male and female. And really, there are two kind of core differences, okay? The first one is that females tend to be shorter, right? Females tend to be shorter. So what you can really do is just draw them at maybe 7 heads or 7.5 heads, right? 7 or 7.5 heads. So they generally tend to be shorter than your idealistic male proportions. And then the second thing, which requires some additional drawing, is that we want to understand some fundamental truth about the skeletal structure of men and women. The basic rule really is that men have broad shoulders and narrow hips, all right? And women have narrow shoulders and broad hips, okay? This is just a basic symbolic representation of what I've just said, but it's useful to remember it in this way. They're not two exact proportions, but basically you want to make sure that in men, the shoulders are broader than the hips, and in women, the hips are broader than the shoulders. And the reason this is so is the pelvis inside, the pelvis from our skeletal structure in men is usually quite narrow and more vertical. And in women, the pelvis is actually very wide, right? It's wide to accommodate childbirth, right? So there's a kind of a typical drawing of the pelvis. And the great trochanter, which is at the top of your femur bone, your main bone in the top part of your leg, in your top leg bone, right, pokes out. And because the woman's hips are broader, the great trochanter pokes out a bit further. So it kind of looks something like that, how the bone is. And so it sticks out further, and then the skin wraps around and goes down to the leg. Whereas with men, the pelvis itself is actually quite a bit narrower. And so the great trochanter doesn't stick out as far, and so male hips are narrower. And that is the end of idealistic body proportions for the human body.